Yeah, so as mentioned, my name is James. I'm based in Treaty in Winnipeg. I'm a white settler, and I use he/him pronouns. And so, yeah, as mentioned. Oh, yeah, one thing I should also mention is that my cats are in the background and make a lot of cat-related noises. So apologies for that in advance. But yeah, I'm going to be speaking about free transit as my quote-unquote idea to save the world. But it's an idea, but it's also a practice that I think each and every one of us can invest in fighting for and struggling for in our own communities, which is why it really excites me as a project. And so I understand that this weekend is meant to be sort of a lighthearted competition of ideas, but I really have to foreground that free transit cannot and will not succeed without the implementation of many other ideas and struggles that will be discussed this weekend. And so this will be familiar to anyone who's heard me talk about this area before. But transit politics really have to be understood as inextricably connected to many other struggles. So housing, labor, food, healthcare, all of these things impact how we talk about transit, but also impact how these services can be accessed. So, for example, building up access to healthcare requires the ability for people to be able to, actually get to the healthcare facilities, whether it's doctor's appointments or pharmacies or these sorts of things. So this obviously doesn't mean that we have to wait for a socialist utopia to implement free transit. It just means that its liberatory potential will only really be realized through connection to other struggles. So shouts out to everyone else who's presenting this weekend. So with all those away, it's time to make the strongest case that I can for free transit. So to begin with, what is free transit? It's, the name is kind of intuitive. It means that transit, so buses, trains, subways, streetcars, but also smaller vehicles, minibuses, minivans, paratransit, all these sorts of things. It means that it's free at the point of service. So that means no fare collection. It means no tap cards. It means no fare enforcement, and also no financial barriers to people who may not be able to, purchase, transportation otherwise. And so transit fares really have to be understood as user fees. So they're obviously paid per use, or per week or per month. Sometimes it's within a time-based window for transfers, like you can pay for a 2-hour transfer for $3 or something. But they're really effectively a regressive form of revenue collection. So low-income transit passes do exist in many municipalities, but oftentimes they're not nearly affordable enough, and they can be suspended at a moment's notice, like we've seen in Toronto with John Tory out of nowhere deciding to suspend new applications for their low-income transit pass. And so ultimately, free transit as a demand real responsibility for individual transit riders to governments, especially higher levels of government, such as the province and the federal government. So just to expand on that a tiny bit, currently operating costs, which are the day-to-day costs of running transit, so salaries, benefits, fuel, all the things that actually go into the day-to-day, tend to be covered partially by municipalities and partially by the user fees, which make up the actual fares themselves, as well as other grants and subsidies and that kind of thing. So what the higher levels of government tend to pay for is the capital infrastructure. So these are the big, sexy, transit projects, the subway lines, the light rail lines, all these sorts of things, which are of course very important, and it's a good thing that they pay for these things. But ultimately, if you talk to transit experts, what they'll say is, having a new subway line without the actual, the drivers hired or the vehicles operating to maximize that subway line is kind of a pointless endeavor. And so we've seen this especially flare up during COVID-19. So 85% drop in ridership across Canada as people have stayed home or in order to get to the places that they need to go, use other means of transportation, which oftentimes means private automobiles. And so because of the heavy reliance on fare collection, many transit agencies across the country, what this has meant is a very, very precipitous decline in revenue. And so the Transit Association for Canada estimates that $400 million per month was being lost, and probably is still being lost throughout COVID-19 due to lower transit ridership. And so this is really exposing the weakness of the current setup of how transit agencies are so fundamentally reliant on fare revenue in order to actually operate. But when there's massive declines in ridership because of a pandemic or because of other things, it reduces their ability to actually, provide service. And it's a bit of a catch-22, or it's what they call like a vicious cycle. So the fewer people riding, the less revenue that comes in, and then the less ability for transit agencies actually to provide the service. We provide some operational funding throughout COVID-19, but it's not nearly enough. And it's also subject to other conditions like ride hailing and other privatizations like we're seeing in Ontario, because the federal government is offering, okay, we're going to cost match with the province, and then the Doug Ford government is saying, okay, well, we're going to take that and then require that the TTC, for example, in Toronto, basically auctions out its low performing lines to Uber. And so the appeal of higher levels of government actually funding transit is it brings stability and it brings long-term predictability to transit agency budgets, and so it means that they can make decisions for the long term, which, given that we're in a climate catastrophe, seems pretty important. So my argument is that free transit is a coherent leftist response to the multitude of crises that we're currently in. So it refuses the neoliberal logic of individual payments based on services, and it demands genuinely collective public services. And so I'm going to run through some of the benefits of free transit and why I think that people should take it seriously as a demand. Of course, there's many more of these, but I'm going to try to keep the presentation as efficient as possible, because there's a lot of other ideas this weekend that should be considered as well. So for one, it increases transit ridership and efficiency of service, which once again, because we're in the middle of a climate catastrophe, should be a major goal for us, whether we're in climate movements, whether we're in fighting for transit, whatever it may be. This should be a priority, because we know that transit is a much more efficient way of getting around in terms of per capita emissions or per rider emissions. So the example that I often refer to is in Dunkirk, France, which is a city of about 200,000 people in France. And so they implemented free transit in 2018. And they found, based on polling of about 2,000 passengers, that half of the passengers surveyed by researchers who were taking free transit said that they take the bus more or much more than ever before. And of those users, 48% said that they were regularly leaving their cars at home. So they're taking transit instead of a car, which is a pretty impressive statistic in terms of how quickly we can get people from cars onto more efficient means of transportation. So part of this speaks to, just the sheer convenience of free transit. So you can leave your house without having to worry about making sure that you have enough coins or that your tap card is topped up. So it enables a new freedom of movement and it erases economic barriers to transportation. And, my argument, I think we've seen this borne out in a lot of contexts, is even a nominal fee on transportation will exclude the most oppressed people in society. So it's money that can't be put towards other basic needs like housing or food. And we saw this, throughout the pandemic as well. There's survey data out of Toronto, and of those continuing to ride the TTC, even though a lot of measures weren't being taken to improve safety, 70% of those who continued to ride said that giving up transit would be too expensive, and 55% said that doing so would mean that they would have to put off or reschedule medical appointments. So these are really, critical barriers to people actually being able to get around. Which, even if it's, $2.50, $3 per fare, this can be enough to actually prevent people from accessing the services that they need. So another argument that I make is that actually removing fares means that buses especially, but other, transit modes as well, don't have to collect fares from everyone, which is a process that wastes an enormous amount of time. So if anyone has, ridden the bus, during rush hour, and this happens to me when I go to the university. I mean, not so much anymore, but when I did previously, is that you could get everyone on the bus, single file quite rapidly, just if everyone was just walking on. But because of the process of fare collection, it backs everything up to this massive amoeba, and then it takes 10 seconds for everyone to process their fare, which really impedes the reliability and the frequency of transit. So that's another argument I make for transit. And this ties to one of the biggest issues that actually impedes transit usage, which I'll briefly discuss later, which is lack of reliable service. So much of this has to do with automotive transit or traffic on the road, but it also has to do with fare collection, and it's why train stations where you complete what's called off-board boarding is so much more efficient. Like the train doesn't have to wait for anyone to finish payment before leaving. So the same can be applied to buses or to other transportation modes with free transit. By removing the necessity to pay, it means that you can board very efficiently and get going more quickly. So that's the first point, is that it increases transit ridership and efficiency of service. The second point that I'll make is that it increases the actual safety for transit workers, which, whether we're petitioning for a Green New Deal or any other kind of just transition, we really need to be foregrounding the experiences and the struggles of labor. And we know from survey data that one of the biggest sources of altercations on buses especially is over fares. So, in addition to the incredible responsibility of having to operate a large transportation vehicle like a bus and giving directions to people and making sure that everyone's going, the bus is going in the right direction, these sorts of things. Transit workers are also responsible for ensuring that everyone pays a fare. And so this can lead to all sorts of unnecessary conflict with people who can't pay or don't want to pay. And I won't go into the reasons why, but it should be quite intuitive for people on the left to understand why people might not be in a position or desire to pay to get from A to B. So there's a 2016 poll in Canada and the US of 500 transit workers who were unionized with ATU, and have found that a vast majority of assaults that happen on transit are the result of fare disputes. Now, there are, of course, many other factors involved in altercations, and I'm not saying that if you erase fares, it's suddenly going to lead to a utopia where nothing bad happens on transit. But this does represent a large opportunity to remove a source of altercations for workers. And there is some concern from some quarters, including some union locals, that this will result in unhoused people riding buses to stay warm in the winter. I argue that this speaks to a much more significant problem in terms of lack of housing and public spaces, and it really shouldn't impede our demand to, abolish fares on transit. Like I said at the beginning, it should really expand our demands to include more things in addition to just free transit. So that's the second point, is that it increases the safety for workers. Third point is that it removes racist and classist fare enforcement. And so we know, once again, from reports and from surveys that the overwhelming percentage of people who are targeted and profiled for fare enforcement are Indigenous and Black people. And this should be of primary concern to us on the left, especially as we're seeing uprisings and struggles for police abolition across the continent. That we should really identify enforcement of transit fares as a opportunity to push back against police and quasi-police powers in public spaces. So an investigation by the Edmonton Journal a couple of years ago found that Indigenous people had received 43.8% of transit tickets issued by the city's law enforcement since 2009, despite only making up 6% of the city's population. So 6% of the population getting ticketed 43.8% of the time. A similar investigation by the Toronto Star found that Black people, who make up 8.9% of the city, received 18.5% of transit tickets issued between 2008 and 2018, for which race information was recorded. So this is obviously a massively disproportionate representation of the population, which is also reflected in many other facets of police and carceral politics. And so I'm not arguing that policing will be entirely eliminated with the elimination of fares, although it should be. Abolitionist politics should be at the center of our struggles. But it does remove a major opportunity for police to interfere in the lives of people just trying to get to work or to grocery stores or these sorts of things. So that's another reason that I think that free transit should really be a really motivating struggle for us. And the final thing I'll touch on at this point is that it provides an opportunity for a really rapid reconstitution of society in response to climate change, but in response to many other issues that we're struggling against, whether it be racial and economic injustice or lack of accessibility for people with disabilities who are disproportionately low income. It really provides a very concrete and cohesive demand for the left to struggle behind that attacks like many oppressions at once. And so just on the subject of climate change specifically, we know that transportation emissions are one of the leading sources of emissions in Canada. And it's the largest consumer of petroleum products. 4 out of every 5 barrels of petroleum products consumed in Canada goes towards transportation. And of course, that's split between freight and aviation, all those sorts of things. But personal automobiles make up a significant chunk of that. And so there's no way to rapidly confront climate change without instigating rapid shifts in modal shares, which is what they call the percentage of transportation mode that people take within a certain area. And we know that over 80% of people in Canada use a car to get to work, or at least did before COVID hit, and everything shifted since then. But we know that people still heavily rely on automobiles to get around. And only 11-12% of people use public transit in Canada to commute to work. And these numbers are higher in places like Vancouver and Toronto, where there have been long-term transit investments made. But even then, it's still only 20 to 25% of the population is relying on it to get to work. And every new vehicle on the road, which is of major concern during COVID-19, as people may be shifting to transportation modes that they think are safer. Every new vehicle on the road, adds extra congestion, extra pollution, extra greenhouse gases to the atmosphere at a time when we need to be rapidly shifting away from these. And we know that road infrastructure locks in all sorts of harms for decades to come. And we just saw the very courageous act by Seth Cardinal Dodging Horse in Calgary from Tsuut'ina Nation, who basically protested the construction, or the finishing of the construction of the ring road in Calgary because of the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands, including his family. And so we know that road infrastructure is incredibly destructive and has a lot of repercussions. And so once again, if we want to be making concrete steps to really rapidly reconstitute society, we need to be opposing these kind of infrastructures and proposing in contrast transit infrastructures and free transit, which really provides a concrete alternative. And so finally, it's really imperative that we motivate as many people as possible to shift their transportation usages to lower emitting modes like transit. I argue that carbon pricing schemes or other sort of neoliberal responses, which put a price on pollution or a price on road use or these sorts of things, are largely a waste of time, and they barely really touch the dial in terms of how we need to be making urgent change. Oftentimes they will piss people off. They will be weaponized by the right to really put excessive focus on something that which is really not costing someone that much. But in terms of the political sphere, it can really take up way too much space than it needs to. And so rather than engage in a punitive approach, which is very visible and which really reminds people of cost of living, I think it's important that we advocate for policies that decommodify society and that reduce the cost of living, rather than increasing commodification and costs. And so, a true climate plan means building the long-term institutions that we need and that, really project a powerful, motivational vision of the future, rather than something that says, what you're doing currently is wrong, but we're not going to really provide anything as an alternative. We're just going to, hit you more in the pocketbook, which is always very exploited by the right. And it also means, struggling in solidarity with people in many other countries and continents. Free transit in Winnipeg or in Toronto is a powerful struggle, but it needs to be united with struggles across Canada, across the U.S. and across the world, especially in the global South. And so I'll conclude by just saying that this rapid reconstitution of society means acknowledging that we're in a class war. So it means, seizing and reallocating existing wealth stolen from the lands of Indigenous peoples and the surplus value of wage laborers towards liberatory ends. And so when people ask, who's going to pay for free transit, it's going to be the rich who have, stolen wealth for generations. I really don't need to list off all the stats about how much wealth is currently being hoarded in tax shelters. But we know that, Canada's top billionaires are $37 billion richer than at the start of the pandemic. And so we hear stats like that, and we know how quickly change can come through, free transit or through, adjacent struggles. And I think that should be really motivating for us. And finally, it means that, that we need to frame free transit as only one part of the struggle for radically improved transit. It's not enough for transit to be free. After all, people won't ride a bus, even if it is free, if it takes an hour for them to, for the bus to show up and such. So it means, demanding things like radically improved frequency and reliability of service, alongside things that might not necessarily be thought of as, traditionally transit issues, such as snow clearing, or making sure that sidewalks are accessible for people using wheelchairs or walkers or these sorts of things, so that they can actually get to the buses in an efficient manner, and these sorts of things. And so, free transit is a really critical demand that I think can help center a lot of adjacent demands for what we think of as a liberatory and socialist transit politics. I'll conclude by just appealing to what I said at the beginning of this presentation, that it all ultimately needs to be part of a broader struggle for liberation, alongside struggles for housing and indigenous rights and labor and all the other things that people are going to be talking about this weekend. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll turn it back to Matt if there's any specific questions or anything that you want me to unpack. I'm happy to address any questions, concerns, criticisms, any of those sorts of things that people have. So thanks for listening. So just a bit of context for people who might not be familiar with this recent trend is, like, obviously Uber and Lyft and other ride-hailing companies have really blitzed our cities and tried, and successfully in most cases convinced policymakers that it is, what is ultimately going to replace transit. And so that's concerning by itself, is that they basically undermine taxis, and that they're intentionally trying to undermine transit as well. But sort of the new phase that's come in over the last several years is that Uber is explicitly being sold to especially smaller municipalities as something that can entirely substitute for transit. And so a famous example of this is in Innisfil, Ontario, is that they were looking at bringing in a couple of bus lines. They did some, cost-benefit analysis, which apparently doesn't include labor rights or greenhouse gas emissions or anything like that. But they proposed that, rather than, running two bus lines, it would be cheaper in the long run if they just contracted Uber to provide rides. And so now what that's meant is that they call it Innisfil Transit, is that people, if they need to get from A to B, they call Uber, and Innisfil will subsidize it. So what we know from what's happened is that the rates have gone up over the years, because Innisfil is obviously trying to squeeze the city for as much as they can. And also they've put a cap on the number of rides that a person can take per month. And so now there's a 30 ride cap. And so no one can, feasibly rely on that for, to get to work and back, because that would be much more than 30 trips. And so some people have indicated outrage at that. And most recently, as I kind of alluded to, because of the way that the federal government is releasing, transit funds, it's meant that Ontario and right-wing governments have imposed conditions in which transit agencies that receive provincial and federal transit funding have to consider replacing low-performing routes with ride-hailing alternatives. And so we know that, ride-hailing is less efficient, it's more polluting, it's terrible for labor rights, it's not accessible for many people with disabilities. And so that's the broad context, I think. In terms of how we actually fight back, I think it's really becoming well acquainted with the facts and arguments against Uber, with the explicit condition that we're really not fighting a war based on facts and logic, despite what many people think we are. The reason that I bring it up is that the conversations I've had, in terms of like with politicians or with other people who are like pro Uber, they often, for whatever reason, mostly because they're capitalists and are, have their own class biases, never have to confront the fact that the policies that they're bringing in via this kind of thing are, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, to loss of accessibility for people with disabilities, all these sorts of things. And so I think just really rapidly becoming acquainted with the realities of how bad ride-hailing is a really good start. I think, the struggle against ride-hailing is a struggle that has to be fought both oppositional, but also in terms of fighting for better transit politics in our cities. So I think that this can best be done through transit rider unions, which is something that I'll talk about often, probably throughout the remainder of this presentation, is that organizing alongside other people who currently rely on transit and really talking to them as opposed to trying to convince policymakers about why ride hailing is not a solution. And I think many people who ride transit already know this because many people have to ride transit because they can't afford a personal automobile and certainly can't afford to rely on Uber. So I think organizing with other transit users and also organizing alongside the transit unions. So unfortunately, some transit unions have been kind of slow to respond to the incursion of Uber and Lyft and other ride-hailing services in their cities. That's certainly not true of every city, but I know in Winnipeg, Uber recently arrived, and there really wasn't too much fight from the union, mostly because the union's fighting a lot of other fights. So I can't, specifically blame them. But I think really reaching out to transit workers and the transit union and trying to make a case not only that we need to be fighting ride hailing because it's explicitly undercutting transit, but also that we need to be fighting for really liberatory transit politics like free transit, like long-term permanent operational funding from higher levels of government, like bus-only lanes. Because I think a really fundamental argument is that the reason that Uber and Lyft and other services like this have been able to gain such a foothold in municipalities is because people understand how unreliable transit can be. And so we need to acknowledge that, and we need to fight for improved transit to basically remove a large chunk of the argument that these companies are making to invade our cities. And so I know that that's kind of a long-winded way of answering how we fight these incursions, but just to kind of summarize, I'd say just becoming really acquainted with the realities of how harmful ride-hailing is, just really getting up on the facts about it, and also, teaming up with other transit riders and transit workers to really come up with a cohesive fight back against this, because ride-hailing it's a huge problem in itself, but it's really a symptom of a much deeper problem of really long-term austerity and privatization of transportation. And so we really need to fight this on many fronts at once. So I hope that answer is helpful and not too vague. I just don't want to be too prescriptive also, because I know many people are already fighting these fights in their own cities. And just to shout out a couple organizations that people can look up, TTC Riders in Toronto, Free Transit Edmonton in Edmonton, obviously. I'm realizing that all the names have the city names in them. Free Transit Ottawa, Ottawa Transit Riders, Free Transit Toronto, like all these groups are doing really excellent work already. So to really observe and to plug in what they're doing and try to kind of, imitate or, at least learn some lessons from their struggles and how they're winning or fighting back and then applying them into our own cities. No, it's a good question. And this is something I think Free Transit Edmonton's done really well, is that their demand is for free transit, obviously, but it's also for really high quality transit. And so this is something that, we'll often hear pushback from sort of neoliberal, sort of more wonkish transit, experts. And I love transit policy wonks, and no disrespect to them at all. But oftentimes I'll be like, well, why are you wasting your time on petitioning for free transit when ultimately what we need is X, Y, and Z? And I think that's a very real, critique, because as I mentioned, free transit is not necessarily of use to someone if the bus isn't showing up on time, or if there's no bus shelter to take shelter in during the winter while you're trying to wait, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's necessary for free transit to be combined with other struggles. So for example, I don't believe TTC Riders explicitly calls for free transit. What they call for is reduced transit fares, permanent operational funding, all these sorts of things. I don't believe that Ottawa Transit Riders calls for free transit, but that's, in that case, there's two transit organizations in the city. And in that sense, they can kind of team up on different fights. And so I think, really framing free transit as a core part of the struggle, which we need to do for, the reasons that I mentioned throughout this presentation, but also within sort of a broader network of what it means to have good quality transit, really high frequency, good reliability, easy to access, all these sorts of things. And I think that also opens up the door to conversations with transit riders and to build these sort of transit unions. The most famous, or sort of the quintessential transit union is the LA Bus Riders Union, which really had very militant struggles throughout the 1990s. And this was in response to racist allocation of, I won't go into the full story now, but it was really responding to the way that transit funding was being funneled towards serving, white affluent riders, which is certainly a struggle that we see playing out in Canada. And so what the Transit Riders Union did there is that they conducted a lot of really militant struggles in terms of I think there was, I'm trying to think of the, I think it was No Seat, No Fare. I'll have to double check on what it was called, but basically they encouraged this militant action in which if there was no seat to, because of overcrowding and because people had to stand, people would not pay a fare. And so they conducted these very militant struggles, which I think is something that we can really try to mirror in our own struggles. They also engaged in, civil litigation and these sorts of things, which, quite successfully. And so those obviously require higher levels of organization, and, not pretending that any of us can just sue our local transit agency for, race-based discrimination or lack of accessibility or these sorts of things. But I think, we can really learn from the struggles of transit unions throughout history, and also more recently to integrate that into our struggle for free transit and better transit and all the other struggles that I've mentioned so far. So so I'll leave it at that. Yeah, it's a great question. When I wrote my book, I really focused on North America's, excluding Mexico, so U.S. and Canada, because I was really looking at finding out like what's gone so wrong with transit politics in North America, and how we can try to fight back. And so unfortunately, my book didn't really examine the very successful struggles in the global South, especially for these sorts of things. And so, in terms of like a sort of a dream or like a future project of mine would be to follow up this book by examining some of the true success stories of countries in the global South, and those sorts of things, because throughout Latin America, throughout Asia, obviously China and Japan, and many other countries, we've seen just incredible investment in like bus rapid transits, bus only lanes, a lot of subways and fixed rail infrastructure, but also in the context of China, for example, they own and are operating 99% of the electric buses in the world, and so I'm not sure what the transit struggles look like in those countries. I think that's an omission of my research, partly due to just constraints of time and having to sort of volunteer a lot of this. But I do think it's something that we really need to be paid more attention to, because these are the success stories in terms of how they've fought and won. Sort of like closer to home, I guess, like throughout the U.S. has been some really successful fights, and part of that I think is kind of an interesting contrast to Canada, where we think, well, maybe not people watching this, but a lot of liberals think that Canada is this progressive wonderland. If we look at, for example, disability legislation, a lot of the gains that have been made in terms of transportation access throughout the U.S. is because of the American Disability Act, the ADA, and the fact that many lawsuits have been able to be filed like using that, and we don't have an equivalent in Canada. And so a lot of the things in terms of like sidewalk cuts or elevators to access subways or these sorts of things have been successfully fought and won through civil litigation through the ADA, which we haven't seen as much of in Canada. But that's certainly not to suggest that there aren't really incredible struggles being done, at home in terms of accessibility for transit. There's been a lot of big wins, but also there's a lot of really big gaping holes. And so, to conclude that in a very roundabout way, we need to be looking to other countries, to other communities, in order to really center our struggles. And I think that's something I would like to emphasize, not only in terms of how we think about free transit, but even if we think about Green New Deal or just transition or that kind of thing, it has to be global and in solidarity with oppressed and exploited communities in countries around the world. So this is a way of me saying ultimately that I haven't done the necessary research to locate and to really write coherently about struggles, especially in the global South. But I think it's just something that we really should be pushing for and trying to connect those struggles, because we can't do socialism in one city or one country, right? So it's really connecting those struggles, which I think has massive potential. So if anyone who's watching this has any cool leads about that kind of thing, let me know, because the work that's been done, throughout Latin America, throughout China, other countries is extremely exciting and motivating, and it really shows that transit politics can be done in a very coherent and a very progressive way compared to whatever we have going on here, which is far less than that. So yeah.
Yeah, well said. I think like one of the things is that this will be promoted to try to get people excited and engaged with this idea. I think that's an easy thing to do relatively for the left. How do we get average people? How do you get your grandma excited about this? Maybe grandma's easier.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, totally. It's a question I've thought about a bit, and also just through watching the successful transit struggles by organizations like TTC Riders and Free Transit Edmonton, is that I think it really does mean in this specific case, outreaching and connecting to people who already rely on transit. And so the physical infrastructure of transit, as anyone who knows, who rides transit will know, is it means a lot of, well, at least pre-COVID, we'll see what it means now, but it means a lot of congregating in bus stops and in train stations and these sorts of things. And so what this means is it's very, I won't say it's easy, but it presents very big opportunities for the left to outreach to people in a very concrete way. So whether that means petitioning people or canvassing or leafleting, or just trying to have conversations with people who may not be politicized yet about transit politics. Like the number of times I've stood in at transit stops and just overheard people complaining about how bad the service is, and I'm not sure if they would self-describe as socialist or what their politics are at all. But people who ride transit are hyper aware of how bad transit is. So I think really outreaching to those people who already rely on it is key. Also, transit union politics are complicated, and I'm not going to pretend that organizations can just outreach to them and it's just a slam dunk opportunity. But Free Transit Edmonton has involved their local ATU since day one. The local they're launched or they presented alongside the Free Transit Edmonton launch. In Toronto, they've done a lot of really excellent work alongside the unions there, and the ATU there has been at the forefront. Both the transit workers and the electricians, I think even more so, have been at the forefront of really demanding free transit and just better transit investments in general. So I think really figuring out the opportunities to outreach to transit riders and to transit workers, and the benefit I think of both of those things to kind of respond to your question about the grandma or people who may not rely on transit politics is if I think this can be quite motivational is people who have positive experiences on transit will talk about that to other people. The inverse is true too. People who have shitty experiences on transit will talk about that as well. It's the same as talking about anyone's commute or anyone's day at work. Is that this just sort of filters through conversation? And I'm really trying to preemptively undercut the idea that I'm overly utopian about this, but I do think that people experiencing good transit and having a sense that transit can and should be politicized will I'm not going to say trickle outwards into people's families and into people's communities. It wasn't until I had a colleague in my undergrad who was talking about their transit experience that actually encouraged me to start to take transit more consistently. And, I think, obviously this requires a degree of open-mindedness, and, car culture is very deep, especially in prairie communities like where I live. But I do think that this can be something that we can all sort of struggle towards. And so really figure out who are our allies. And that this is just, textbook organizing strategy is figuring out who are your friends and your allies. In this case, it'll oftentimes be riders and workers. But there's also a lot of people who I think could be quite easily convinced that this is a really smart investment, and that it's something that can really, decrease greenhouse gas emissions, decrease air pollution, increase accessibility for people with disabilities and seniors, and then just increase, a sense of mobility and freedom for everyone in the city. Because, even drivers, at least I would say most drivers, there's a couple of freakish people out there who do truly love, driving and that sort of thing. But most drivers really, dislike commutes and dislike, gridlock and these sorts of things. And I think would quite happily consider other options if if it's affordable, or in this case free, hopefully, if it can get them to where they need to go in a reliable way. And so that means not only during 9 to 5, but it also means for shift workers and off peak and these sorts of things, that people can feel comfortable on it, and that people feel like ultimately respected, because that's something we've seen throughout the pandemic, is just like a fundamental lack of respect by most transit agencies and most municipalities towards transit users. In Winnipeg, for example, transit was never made free. There was never rear door boarding. There was never, really, there wasn't a mask mandate on transit until, like a month ago. And so like a lot of these things just like convey a lot of disrespect to transit riders. And I think this is something that people who don't currently take transit are rightfully concerned about. And that's why we have to be honest about the state of transit, but also recognize the opportunities to mobilize people who, currently rely on it, currently work on it, and people who would otherwise be convinced to maybe make that shift. Just to conclude, that stat from France, in which it was upwards of 50% of new riders had left their car at home, I think is a really exciting statistic to consider, especially just given that we know all the harms of automobility. We know that they lead to a lot of greenhouse gas pollutions and air pollution, that they lead to a lot of congestion and collisions with pedestrians and cyclists and all these sorts of things. And to really be able to frame the harms brought by automobility, but also the opportunities brought by free transit and improved transit, I think can help convince people that this is just it's a good policy decision, not only for existing riders, but hopefully for future riders too.
One thing I love just listening to you talk is everything you're saying. You drop a lot of like decent bombs in there, like trickle
Oh,
outward.
thanks. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Well, I just didn't want to say trickle down. I just didn't want to legitimize that in any way.
I think one thing the left has to do better is be memeable, easy content,
Yes,
easy to understand,
for
and I
sure.
think trickle outward. I think you may have just saved the world with that idea alone.
Thank you. I appreciate
I
it.
do have a question here. What are
For
the
sure.
limits to private electric vehicles and the harms of electric buses?
Oh my God, great question. I'm also sensitive of the time, Matt. So I will try to limit myself to responding to the specifics of this. But I'll start with the private electric vehicles. For one, unfortunately, the right and climate change deniers have really dominated the discussion about this. Is the sheer resource consumption of the batteries and of the actual electric vehicles themselves. We know that the amount of lithium and cobalt and nickel and all these other mineable like minerals and metals have major impacts on indigenous communities in Canada, in countries such as Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, obviously, and also in the DRC in terms of cobalt mining. All these sorts of things are going to be massively exponentially upscaled in order to produce the batteries that we need for personal electric vehicles. And the response from sort of the EV, or like the electric vehicle crowd, has just been to like kind of disregard that mostly and be like, well, we're going to improve our supply chains. We're going to hopefully domesticate a lot of the mining that happens. But like, I don't find that to be a sufficient response at all, given that we know the harms of mining that happens in Canada. So even if mining happens in BC or northern Manitoba, these are indigenous lands, and when disasters happen, such as the Mount Polley disaster, which happened in BC in 2014, which is the most catastrophic tailings disaster in Canadian history, it's indigenous communities that pay the price for that, right? So mining will have to happen in some capacity in order to build renewable technologies, and even to build a lot of transit vehicles, which require steel and which require if there's going to be batteries, all the things I just mentioned. But the argument that I make is that that on a per rider basis, you need far fewer metals and minerals to actually get people from A to B. And also, the better planned your infrastructure is. So, for example, if you're using trolley cars or streetcars, which are connected either through rails or through it's called a third rail, or through overhead wires, you don't need batteries because all the electricity that's actually powering your vehicles is coming through wires or through the rail itself. And again, this isn't to suggest that there aren't serious supply chain questions and issues that we have to resolve, especially if we're fighting, and we should be fighting in solidarity with countries in the global south and with indigenous nations. But if we want to actually radically reduce the amount of impact that we're going to have in terms of this massive transition that has to happen in order for us to avoid catastrophic climate change, it really has to be done through finding the most efficient way of getting people. And again, efficiency is like kind of a gross word; it's a neoliberal word, but there are like real world facts that we know that people riding transit require less energy on a per rider basis to get from A to B than anyone else. So that's really just resolving the actual resources and the electricity question. So I'll just like steamroll through the final parts. Is that we know that personal electric vehicles don't resolve any of the other issues that are associated with automobility, aside from reducing or like eliminating tailpipe emissions and basically relocating those elsewhere to a coal, natural gas, etc. facility. It could be hydropower, whatnot. So we know that they continue to generate air pollution from brakes and tires. We know that they continue to hit and to kill pedestrians and cyclists. We know that they continue not to resolve accessibility issues for people with disabilities and for seniors or people who don't want to drive or who can't drive. So youth who can't, get their driver's license. And this is especially pertinent to rural areas. So, personal electric vehicles may decarbonize transportation in a rural area, but it doesn't fundamentally resolve any of the issues that currently impede transportation access for people, due to all the things that I just mentioned. There's also issues that I won't dive into too deeply now. But if anyone is like really interested in this, I can read my book. I hate to plug my book, but it's like a lot of these facts are there. Is that in terms of like data ownership and surveillance and policing, all these sorts of things, we know that the technologies that are going into personal electric vehicles and maybe autonomous vehicles, if are like rapidly increasing the amount of like personal data that is produced and owned by the companies, and then sold to companies in order to better cater marketing employees to us. And so like there are many concerns that also plague transit in terms of surveillance and policing and these sorts of things. But my fundamental argument is that we can far more efficiently and effectively fight for public ownership and public control over an existing public service, rather than trying to persuade these venture capital backed companies, or in this case, after Uber and Lyft have gone their IPO, they're all privately or publicly owned, I guess, but not in the good way. And it makes it very difficult to wage these fights successfully. So I know that I just went through a whole bunch of various issues that I hope resolve the question. I think the question might have been more to do with electrification, but I'll just finally note to conclude that electric vehicles require a ton of resources. Buses, trains, subways also require resources, but on a per rider basis require a lot fewer. And so that if we want to build communities that are accessible, that don't hit and kill pedestrians and cyclists, that reduce air pollution and all the rest, we really need to be putting our funding and our resources towards a far more efficient way of transportation, which is transit, alongside making communities safer through active transportation infrastructure, so expanding sidewalks and cycling infrastructure, and ultimately, fighting for public housing in which we can really, because, like transit-oriented development, as it's currently understood, it's entirely privatized, and so this means that, it's really developers calling the shots. But if we can do, if we can build public housing and build public transit in ways that are genuinely public and genuinely equitable, I think we can really maximize, our abilities to radically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution, and really undercut the claims that the Teslas and the Nissans of the world are making about the need for personal electric vehicles, because we don't have time to fully deploy electric vehicles in the time that we need, and we also, like, from a point of view of like solidarity and equality and whatever words that we want to use with communities in the global south and indigenous nations across North America, we can't afford to let personal electric vehicles be the dominant mode of transportation, because it's going to have catastrophic repercussions. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Sorry for going on there and maybe going in a roundabout way as I usually do.
No, that was beautiful. We have a comment that answers the question completely, so that's excellent.
Great.
We're going to wind down now. Did you have a last, I don't know, maybe 30-second final thought?
Sure. Yeah. Just to kind of summarize that free transit is it's a struggle that has to be waged alongside many other struggles for police abolition, for public housing, for harm reduction, for access to mental health and substance use resources, to food security, to all the things that people are going to be talking about throughout this weekend. And so I just really applaud everyone who is presenting and listening into this, and hope that this can be of use to you in the struggles in your community. Also, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter anytime if you have any follow-up questions, or want to talk more about this. I love to talk transit politics, and am happy to chat more with anyone who wants to.
That's awesome. Thank you so much again for making the time, James. I think that was a very convincing argument, and
Great.
best of luck with the vote there.